In the year of our Lord 1410, when the snows of winter had melted and the fields of Poland and Lithuania bore the green promise of harvest, there rose upon the lands of Christendom a shadow darker than the storm. For many years the Teutonic Knights, clad in their white mantles marked with the Black Cross, had pressed their steel upon the borders of the Polish crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. With sword and fire they had sought dominion, claiming the mantle of holy warriors, yet hungering evermore for land and gold. From Krakow to Vilnius, the people whispered of the inevitability of war. The proud king, the Ladislaw Jagiello, wise and deliberate, called forth his nobles, urging them to prepare for the reckoning. Messengers rode with dust upon their cloaks, carrying sealed letters to castellans and voivodes, bidding them muster horse and foot alike. The beating of blacksmiths' hammers filled the towns, forging spearheads and mending armor, while in the fields peasants offered prayers for their sons who would soon bear arms. In distant Lithuania, the Grand Duke Vytautas the Great summoned his fierce retinues, Tartar horsemen, men of Samogitia hardened by long strife, and Lithuanian knights who bore the scars of many battles. Their tongues were many, their customs diverse, yet their cause was one, for they knew the yoke of the Teutons was cruel and merciless. Thus, as spring turned to summer, the roads filled with men-at-arms, wagons laden with supplies, banners unfurled to the wind. Monks in their cloisters prayed for victory, while old crones muttered omens of blood and fire. All knew that a great reckoning was at hand, greater than any that Christendom had seen in many a generation. And so it was that the year 1410 dawned not in peace, but with the beating of war drums, and the hearts of men trembled with both fear and hope, awaiting the mighty clash that would decide the fate of kingdoms. In the month of May, when the fields of rye stood green and the rivers swelled with spring waters, the King of Poland, the Ladislaw Jagiello, sent forth his heralds to every corner of his realm. From the castles of Mazovia to the distant lands of Red Ruthenia, his summons rang out. By sword and shield shall the kingdom be defended, and by God's will shall justice be done. The knights of Poland obeyed, fastening their spurs and donning their surcoats embroidered with family crests. They rode with pride beneath their standards. The crimson banner of Krakow, the black eagle of Silesia, the golden lion of Ruthenia. From villages and towns came the levy of peasants, bearing pikes, axes, and simple wooden shields, their faces set in grim resolve. Though many were untrained, they carried in their hearts the fire of duty, for they fought not only for king and crown but for their fields, their wives, and their children. Far to the east, the Grand Duke Vytautas likewise summoned his strength. His messengers rode swifter than hawks, commanding the gathering of all who bore arms in Lithuania. Warriors from Smolensk, their armor heavy and their swords broad, answered his call. From the wild steppes thundered the mounted Tartars, light and swift, their bows strung and their quivers full. From the forests of Samogitia came men hardened by endless strife, bearing long spears and curved sabers. And so a great host began to stir. It was said that never before had such a multitude been assembled. Poles and Lithuanians, Ruthenians and Tartars, knights of noble birth and peasants of humble lot. They marched not only with steel but also with song and prayer, their priests blessing the standards and sprinkling holy water upon the men. The name of Christ was invoked, yet each knew in his heart that it was his own arm that must strike true. Meanwhile, in the fortified towns of Prussia, the Teutonic Knights too prepared. They polished their armor until it gleamed like the morning sun, and their war horses were clad in caparisons of white and black. They called upon their allies from the west, knights from far-off Germany, Bohemia, and even from France and England, eager for glory and plunder. To them, the campaign was a crusade, holy in name yet worldly in ambition. Thus, as the hosts gathered and the banners multiplied like clouds before a storm, the land held its breath. For all knew that the earth itself would soon drink deeply of blood, and the fate of nations would be decided upon the sword's edge. When the feast of St. John had passed and the midsummer sun rode high above the fields, the great hosts of Poland and Lithuania began their march. From Krakow the king rode forth, his banner borne high, the white eagle upon crimson, proud and fierce. With him went knights of high lineage, their retinues glittering in steel, and common levies trudging with wooden carts that groaned beneath grain, salted meat, and barrels of water. The roads shook with the thunder of hooves, for Poland's cavalry was mighty and many. Banners waved in the summer wind, each proclaiming the pride of its province. The ox head of Kuievia, the golden griffin of Pomerania, the stag of Greater Poland. Priests strode alongside the ranks, chanting psalms and raising crosses above the men, bidding them march with hearts unafraid. From the east came Vytautas and his warriors. Their banners were strange to the eyes of the Poles, the black columns of Vilnius, the blue of Trakai, and the fierce sigils of Samogitia. Beside them rode Tartar horsemen, swift and lean, their steppe steeds adorned with feathers and bells. They carried curved bows, and their eyes glinted like eagles watching prey. With them also came men from distant Rus, heavy with chain and steel, their Slavic tongues mingling with the Lithuanian speech. The march was no simple thing, for the army was vast and diverse. Day upon day they crossed rivers by makeshift bridges, felled trees to clear paths, and drove wagons through muddy fords. Yet discipline was kept, for Jagiello was cautious and measured, fearing to waste his strength in rashness. He often halted the host to allow all banners to catch up, for he knew the Teutons would be swift to strike at any stragglers. And so, through fields and forests, across villages both friendly and wary, the allied host advanced northward into Prussia. Ahead rode scouts and hunters, eyes sharp for ambush. Behind stretched miles of camp followers. Smiths, cooks, merchants, women tending the sick, and even wandering minstrels who sang of heroes to come. The people of the land watched in awe as the banners passed, for it seemed as though the very earth was being shaken by the weight of men and horses. Some knelt to bless the soldiers. Others wept, knowing that not all who marched would ever return. Thus moved the tide of Poland and Lithuania, like a river of steel and hope flowing toward its fate. And though the men's voices rose in song, in their hearts each carried the shadow of fear, for all knew the Teutonic knights were already sharpening their swords and praying for victory in their own chapels. In the strongholds of Prussia, word came swiftly that the hosts of Poland and Lithuania had begun their march. The Teutonic knights, those brethren of the order clad in white mantles marked with the black cross, wasted no hour in idleness. Their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, a man of stern countenance and fiery temper, called his captains to council within the stone walls of Marienburg, the mightiest fortress in all the north. There, amidst the banners of the order and the cold light of torches, he spoke with commanding voice. The foe gathers with countless hordes, Poles, Lithuanians, Tartars, heathens, and schismatics. Yet we are chosen by God to defend his church and to keep his lands pure. By faith, by discipline, and by steel shall we overcome. His words were received with solemn nods, for the knights, though far fewer in number, trusted in their order, their training, and the righteousness of their cause. Messengers were sent abroad, summoning allies from the far reaches of Christendom. From Franconia, from Swabia, from the Rhineland came knights eager for adventure and plunder. From distant Bohemia arrived contingents of armored men, while mercenaries from the German cities joined the call, lured by silver and the promise of loot. It was said that even some Englishmen, veterans of the 100 Years' War, rode to Prussia to pledge their arms to the order. The villages and towns of Prussia were ordered to supply food, wagons, and fodder. Blacksmiths worked day and night in the forges, hammering out nails for horseshoes, rivets for armor, and bolts for crossbows. Churches rang with the sound of bells, calling the faithful to pray for victory, while priests thundered from their pulpits that to fight beneath the black cross was to earn eternal reward. Soon, the order's banners began to gather. The great standard of the Grand Master, white with a black cross, was raised high, flanked by the banners of Comters from Danzig, Elbing, and Königsberg. Behind them marched ranks of disciplined foot soldiers, halberdiers, pikemen, and crossbowmen, their armor glinting in the sun. Heavy cavalry, the pride of the order, rode at the fore, their destriers clad in barding, their lances tall as trees. Though smaller in number than the hosts of Jagiello and Vytautas, the Teutonic army was a fearsome machine of war, hardened, disciplined, and bound by the strict rule of the order. Where the allies were diverse and sometimes quarrelsome, the knights were of one voice, drilled to obey without hesitation. Thus, like iron meeting iron, two tides moved inexorably toward one another, the great coalition of Poland and Lithuania against the proud and unbending order of the Teutonic Knights. The land between them trembled, knowing it was soon to be the stage upon which Christendom would witness a clash the like of which had not been seen in 100 years. As the allied host drew nearer to the lands of the Teutons, King Władysław Jagiello established his command near the village of Grunwald, a place of gentle hills and forests that would soon bear the marks of men and horses in bloody labor. Under the shade of oaks and beneath fluttering banners, the king held council with his captains, his face grave and lined by the cares of leadership. He considered carefully the composition of his army. Polish knights, resplendent in polished steel, mounted on proud destriers; Lithuanian horsemen, fierce and swift; Tartar archers, light as shadows, capable of striking with deadly accuracy from afar; and peasants bearing pikes, shields, and makeshift weapons, their courage held steady by hope and fear alike. Each man, he knew, carried his own heart's weight into battle. Beside him stood the Grand Duke Vytautas, a man of broad shoulders and keen eyes, whose wisdom had been forged in decades of strife. Together they planned the formation of the host, arranging the banners and choosing where each contingent would be placed. The king's gaze swept over the men, noting the tension in their shoulders, the tightening of reins in the hands of horsemen, and the occasional falter of a young squire trying to appear brave. That night, before the clash, the king withdrew to his pavilion. Alone, he knelt upon the ground, praying to God to grant strength and guidance. The torchlight flickered upon the maps and charts before him, casting shadows like ghostly figures. He thought not only of strategy but of the lives that would soon be laid upon the altar of war. Men who had trained for years, lads who had never held a sword, and veterans whose valor would be tested once more. Outside the pavilion, the campfires burned low, the murmur of men mingling with the cries of sentries and the whinny of horses. Some soldiers whispered prayers. Others tried to find solace in song or in letters from home. The air was thick with anticipation, sweat, smoke, and the scent of earth turned by countless feet. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a hush fell across the camp. Men adjusted armor, checked weapons, and tightened straps. Horses pawed the ground, sensing the tension of their riders. Priests moved among the ranks, blessing men and banners alike, their voices a soft murmur amidst the rising wind. King Władysław mounted his horse, and Vytautas rode beside him. Together, they gazed upon the field of Grunwald, a rolling expanse of grass and slight hills, the perfect stage for the confrontation to come. Each man carried hope, fear, and determination. Yet the king, alone in his mind, bore the heaviest weight: the lives of thousands and the fate of kingdoms. The hour of reckoning approached. Soon, the clash of swords and the cries of men would shatter the morning stillness, and the history of this age would be written in blood. At the breaking of dawn, the army of Poland and Lithuania formed upon the fields of Grunwald like a living tapestry of color and steel. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, their symbols proclaiming the pride of provinces and regions. Across the field, the white mantles of the Teutonic Knights gleamed in the rising sun, the black crosses stark against them, their ranks orderly and disciplined, a deadly machine awaiting the signal to strike. The two hosts approached one another with careful steps, the earth trembling beneath the pounding of thousands of hooves. Scouts rode to the front, their eyes seeking the faintest sign of ambush or weakness, while archers readied their bows, quivers full, fingers twitching in anticipation. The air was tense with a strange quiet, broken only by the occasional neigh of a horse or the creak of armor. Suddenly, a signal horn echoed across the field, and the first clash began. Polish knights charged, their lances lowered, aimed at the enemy line. Shields splintered under the force of impact. The screams of men and horses mingled with the clash of steel. The knights of the Teutonic Order met the charge with a wall of disciplined defense, their own lances shattering against mounted riders, while foot soldiers thrust spears and swung axes with deadly precision. The initial encounter was fierce but brief. Men fell in heaps, horses toppled, and the ground became slick with blood. Yet neither side yielded. The Lithuanians, mounted and light-footed, struck at the flanks, raining arrows upon the enemy and retreating swiftly to avoid the weight of heavy cavalry. Tartar horsemen darted like shadows, their curved sabers flashing, cutting down men and horse alike before vanishing into the forested edges of the battlefield. Amidst the chaos, King the Ladislaw and Vytautas observed from the center, issuing commands, repositioning units, and sending reserves to reinforce struggling lines. The roar of men, the clang of weapons, and the cries of the wounded filled the air, a symphony of terror and valor. Some knights fought with silent, grim determination, eyes fixed upon the enemy, while others shouted oaths to God and King, their voices rising above the din. By midday, the battle had settled into a grinding clash of attrition. The field of Grunwald became a sea of men and horses, banners torn and trampled, the scent of blood thick and choking. Every yard gained was bought with sacrifice, every retreat contested. Yet in the midst of slaughter, moments of heroism shone like sparks. A knight saving a comrade from certain death, a peasant repelling a mounted foe, a Tartar archer picking off a commander with a single arrow. Thus began the Great Reckoning, a battle that would be remembered for ages, where courage and despair, hope and fear, were bound together in the relentless tide of war. By the hour of afternoon, the Battle of Grunwald had raged with unyielding fury. The earth was churned to mud beneath thousands of hooves and boots, littered with the fallen and the shattered remains of banners. Smoke from burning wagons and torches mingled with the iron scent of blood, hanging thick and heavy in the summer air. At first, the knights of the Teutonic Order held firm, their discipline and armor allowing them to withstand the initial charges of the Polish and Lithuanian knights. Ulrich von Jungingen rode among his men, his voice carrying above the din. "Stand! Hold the line! The honor of the order demands no less." His men met him with shouts of assent, their lances forming a wall, their swords swinging in deadly arcs. Yet even the most disciplined cannot endure endlessly against overwhelming numbers. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas had anticipated this. They had placed reserves behind the initial ranks, fresh horsemen and archers, waiting for the moment when the Teutons would tire. As the sun climbed, a signal was given. Trumpets blaring, banners waved, and the reserves surged forward. Lithuanian cavalry struck the flanks with a ferocity that scattered Teutonic squadrons. Tartar horsemen circled behind the enemy, cutting off retreat and striking where armor was weakest. In the center, the Polish knights pressed with renewed vigor. Spears shattered against shields, and swords clanged in desperate combat. The Grand Master himself, mounted upon a massive destrier, sought to rally his men, but even his presence could not halt the tide. Horses and riders fell in heaps, dragging banners into the mud. A cry rose from the Allied ranks, a mixture of triumph and savage determination, as they sensed the hour of victory drawing near. Yet the battle was not won without cost. Brave men of Poland, Lithuania, and Allied lands fell by hundreds, their blood soaking the earth. Knights who had trained all their lives were brought low, their visors dented, their armor pierced. Yet for every fallen, 2 Teutons lay prone before them, their discipline failing in the face of relentless attack. Even the most stalwart of the order began to waver, and rumors spread among the ranks. The Grand Master had fallen in the thick of combat. The moment of turning came when Vytautas, seeing the enemy faltering, ordered a full charge. Polish heavy cavalry thundered forward in a wave, riding down resistance, while Lithuanian and Tartar horsemen struck from the sides. The disciplined lines of the Teutonic knights, though formidable, began to crumble under the weight of numbers and strategy. Shouts of victory rose above the battlefield, even as the groans of the dying echoed through the fields. By late afternoon, the tide had decisively turned. What had begun as a clash of equal might now resembled a relentless flood sweeping away the proud knights of the Teutonic Order. Yet even in victory, the Allied commanders knew the cost. The fields were littered with men and horses, banners trampled into mud, and the screams of the wounded haunted every moment. The battle was nearing its final, brutal chapter, and the fates of kingdoms hung upon the next hour. Amidst the shattered ranks and the roar of combat, acts of heroism and sacrifice lit the grim canvas of Grunwald like sudden flashes of lightning. Knights and common soldiers alike faced death with courage born of desperation, honor, or sheer necessity. One such tale spread quickly among the Allied troops. Sir Mikołaj, a Polish knight of noble birth, found himself surrounded by Teutonic knights after his unit was cut off from the main charge. Alone, he raised his sword and held the line, cutting down one enemy after another, buying precious time for fleeing comrades. When finally he fell, pierced by a dozen lances, he lay among the bodies of foes and friends alike, his visor dented and his banner torn, yet his courage remained untarnished. Near the center of the field, a group of Lithuanian spearmen, led by a young commander named Algirdas, found themselves facing a squad of heavy Teutonic cavalry. Outnumbered and outmatched, they formed a tight circle, shields locked and pikes bristling outward. Each man fought knowing it could be his last, yet they held until reinforcements arrived, their sacrifice allowing others to flank the enemy and turn the tide in that sector. Even the Tartar horsemen performed feats of deadly grace, darting into enemy lines, loosing volleys of arrows, and then vanishing before the heavy swords could reach them. Some rode straight into the path of death to draw enemy attention, guiding Polish and Lithuanian knights to strategic advantage. Their courage, swift and lethal, left an indelible mark upon the battlefield. Amidst these displays, the Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen himself met his fate. Surrounded by knights, he fought with valor, striking down enemies in rapid succession. Yet he was finally overcome by sheer numbers. His fall sent shockwaves through the Teutonic ranks. Men who had once thought their discipline unshakable now wavered, some fleeing, others desperately attempting to rally around battered banners. The cries of the dying filled the air, men screaming for mercy, comrades calling to fallen friends, horses rearing in panic. Chaplains moved among the wounded, offering last rites and prayers, their voices trembling yet steadfast. The scene was one of chaos, courage, and tragedy intertwined, where the distinction between hero and martyr blurred beneath the weight of combat. By evening, the battlefield was a tapestry of blood and valor. The Allied forces, though victorious in many sectors, were not untouched by grief. Each commander counted losses, mourned the brave, and honored the fallen with whispered prayers. Even amidst triumph, they recognized that the courage of those who perished had forged the path to victory. Thus, Grunwald became more than a field of battle. It became a testament to the human spirit, to bravery, sacrifice, and the price of defending one's homeland. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked fields of Grunwald, the structure of the Teutonic lines began to falter. The once disciplined formations, so tightly held in the morning, now staggered under the relentless pressure of the Allied host. Polish heavy cavalry, renewed from reserves, struck deep into the center, cleaving through the knights who had remained steadfast since dawn. The Lithuanian horsemen, swift and merciless, wheeled around the flanks, cutting down any who tried to escape. Tartar archers from the edges of the forest loosed volley after volley, their arrows finding gaps in armor and shields, sowing chaos among the enemy ranks. The Grand Master's death earlier in the day had left the order leaderless at a critical juncture. His lieutenants attempted to rally the men, shouting commands over the din, but confusion reigned. Some units held, others scattered, and the once proud knights found themselves fighting not as a united force, but as isolated pockets, surrounded and vulnerable. Across the field, the Allies pressed relentlessly. Polish knights grappled with Teutons in fierce hand-to-hand combat, their swords clanging against armor, axes biting through shields, and spears finding gaps in mail. Lithuanian riders struck again and again, forcing retreat after retreat, while Tartar skirmishers struck with surgical precision, disappearing into the forests after each deadly blow. Even among the Teutons, moments of valor persisted. Knights fought with desperate courage, forming last defensive rings around banners, their eyes blazing with determination even as the tide turned against them. Yet the sheer weight of the Allied assault was overwhelming. Horses trampled fallen men, banners were captured or torn from masts, and the ground became a quagmire of mud, blood, and shattered arms. By late afternoon, it was clear. The Teutonic lines had collapsed. Small groups of knights continued to resist, but they were encircled, cut down, or forced into flight. Some fled toward the forests, others surrendered, and a few sought the relative safety of nearby castles, knowing that the field was lost. The Allied army, though weary and bloodied, held the field in triumph, their banners waving over the wreckage of the enemy. Grunwald had been won, yet the victory was tempered by the toll it had taken. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded, banners and standards lay trampled and torn, and the cries of the dying lingered in the air like a dark lament. Even in triumph, the commanders knew that the cost of glory had been staggering, and that the memory of this day would haunt the lands for generations to come. When the sun sank behind the western hills, casting a blood-red hue upon the fields of Grunwald, a grim silence settled across the battlefield. The roar of combat had ceased, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the occasional cry of a horse still trapped in mud or among the fallen. The ground was sodden with blood, churned by thousands of boots and hooves, strewn with shattered weapons, broken armor, and torn banners. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas rode slowly across the field, accompanied by their captains, surveying the fruits of their victory. Their eyes took in the sight of the fallen, men of Poland, Lithuania, Ruthenia, and Tartar lands lying alongside the once feared knights of the Teutonic Order. The magnitude of loss weighed heavily on their hearts, for even in triumph, the cost of battle was apparent. The wounded cried out for aid. Priests and surgeons moved among them, offering prayers, bandages, and whatever comfort could be found in such a nightmarish hour. Horses were tended, for many had survived the day but suffered grievous wounds. Fires were lit to ward off beasts and to provide light for the care of the injured, and small groups of men began the grim task of gathering the dead. Captured knights, many of noble lineage, were brought before the Allied commanders. Some offered ransom, others pleaded for mercy. The victors, though tempered by fatigue and sorrow, dealt justice according to both custom and strategy. High-ranking prisoners would be held for ransom, while common soldiers were either released or detained as circumstances required. Amidst the aftermath, tales of heroism spread quickly. Accounts of single knights holding off dozens, of peasants standing firm against mounted knights, and of Tartar archers striking with uncanny precision filled the camps. These stories would be told long after the bodies were buried, shaping the legends of Grunwald for generations to come. As night deepened, a solemn vigil arose among the Allied troops. Fires burned on the field, casting flickering light across the carnage. Men knelt in prayer, seeking forgiveness for the violence they had wrought, and offering thanks for the lives spared. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of the dead, and the air was heavy with sorrow, exhaustion, and the quiet, eerie sense that history had just been made. Though victorious, the Allies knew the work was far from done. The field of Grunwald was a testament to the brutal cost of war, and the consequences of that day would ripple through kingdoms, alliances, and hearts alike. With the dawn of the following day, the Allied commanders gathered once more to consider the next move. Though the Teutonic army had been shattered upon the field of Grunwald, the great fortress of Marienburg still loomed, a symbol of order's power and ambition. The king and the Grand Duke knew that the victory on the field was decisive, yet incomplete. To strike at the heart of the enemy would ensure lasting effect. The army moved cautiously, mindful of ambushes or hidden contingents of surviving knights. Banners rose again, and trumpets sounded, their notes echoing across the low hills and valleys. Columns of infantry, cavalry, and camp followers advanced slowly, the memory of yesterday's carnage still fresh in every mind. Scouts rode ahead, reporting the absence of large enemy formations but noting fortifications strengthened and bridges watched. As they approached Marienburg, the city's walls became visible across the flat fields, tall, imposing, and seemingly impregnable. Towers of stone rose above the landscape, battlements bristling with archers and defenders. Fires could be seen within, and smoke from beacons indicated preparation. Yet the defenders' morale appeared shaken by the devastating loss at Grunwald. King the Ladislaw called a council in the field. The allied commanders debated whether to assault the fortress directly or lay siege. Some argued that the garrison, though diminished, could still repel an attack and that the army was weary from the previous day's exertion. Vytautas, ever calculating, suggested that a siege, combined with pressure on surrounding Teutonic holdings, might bring the fortress to terms without further slaughter. Despite their strategic caution, the march itself was a demonstration of power. Villages along the route sent provisions, and peasants came out to witness the allied host, amazed and frightened by the sheer magnitude of men, horses, and banners. Survivors of Grunwald were tended, wounded men were evacuated, and the army's engineers began to consider siege engines and stockades, should the need arise. By nightfall, the army had reached a ridge overlooking Marienburg. Fires were lit in the camps, and sentries were posted along every approach. The city's walls loomed above them, a silent challenge that seemed almost to mock the blood spilled on the fields below. The commanders knew that the fortress would not yield easily, yet the spirit of the allies was high, bolstered by victory and by the knowledge that the Teutons had been broken once before. Thus, the shadow of war moved from the open fields of Grunwald toward the stone heart of Prussia itself, and the fate of Marienburg, like the fate of kingdoms, hung in delicate balance. In the days following the march to Marienburg, the Allied army settled into careful preparation. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas understood that taking the fortress by force would be costly, and so the emphasis shifted to strategy as much as strength. Engineers measured walls, studied gates, and surveyed the surrounding terrain, planning the placement of siege engines, while carpenters and smiths labored day and night to repair wagons and forge implements of war. The camp became a hive of activity. Soldiers drilled in formation to maintain readiness, archers practiced their aim, and cavalry tested the coordination of charges. Camp followers scouted for water and forage, and medics tended to the wounded from Grunwald, binding scars and soothing burns. Even in this relative calm, the tension of siege hung in the air like a heavy mist. The men knew that every day of inaction was an opportunity for the enemy to recover or send reinforcements. At the same time, diplomacy moved quietly alongside the march of armies. Envoys were sent to nearby Prussian towns, offering terms of surrender or alliance, urging that the fall of Marienburg could signal a new order in the region. Some towns yielded, sending provisions and pledges of loyalty, while others resisted, their loyalties tied to the order or their own fears of reprisal. Negotiations and letters flowed, for the commanders recognized that political maneuvering might achieve what steel alone could not. Despite the strategy and preparation, morale among the men remained high. Tales of heroism from Grunwald circulated the camp. Knights who had held their ground against impossible odds, peasants who had fought like lions, and Tartar horsemen whose arrows struck true from afar. These stories reminded the soldiers of the stakes, not merely victory, but justice and the survival of their homelands. Yet beneath the activity, unease lingered. The fortress of Marienburg was formidable, its walls high and thick, towers bristling with defenders. Rumors circulated that surviving Teutonic knights had regrouped within, sharpening their blades and preparing traps for any assault. Every man knew that the coming days could be long, grueling, and filled with death, even without the pitched battle they had already endured. Thus, the Allied army waited, poised between action and anticipation, blending the might of force with the cunning of diplomacy. Grunwald had been won, but Marienburg, the heart of the Teutonic order, remained a challenge yet to be faced. And as night fell upon the camp, the fires flickered against the walls of the fortress, casting shadows that seemed to whisper of trials yet to come. As dawn broke over the stone walls of Marienburg, the Allied army prepared for what many feared would be the ultimate test of their strength and endurance. The field before the fortress was quiet, yet tense. The memory of Grunwald's blood-soaked clash hung like a ghost over every man and horse. Scouts reported activity within the walls, the survivors of the Teutonic order moving in precise, purposeful motions, reinforcing gates, manning battlements, and readying the towers for defense. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas convened with their captains. The plan was simple in intent but complex in execution. Pressure the defenders through a combination of siege and feigned assaults, forcing them into desperation. Siege engines, newly constructed, were wheeled into position under the watchful eyes of engineers, their massive wooden frames creaking as pulleys and counterweights were tested. Archers and crossbowmen took posts upon small rises, aiming at the walls and towers, ready to cut down any defenders who ventured too close. The first signals of confrontation came with volleys of arrows raining upon the walls. Stones and boiling pitch were hurled from the battlements, striking soldiers and horses alike. Yet the Allied forces advanced steadily, shields raised, engines moving forward, and ladders prepared for climbing. Engineers filled moats, while sapper teams worked to undermine gates, each man risking death in close proximity to the enemy's archers and boiling oil. Inside Marienburg, the Teutonic Knights fought with desperation. Their discipline, once their greatest strength, became a mechanism of survival. Men manned walls and shifts, towers rang with warning bells, and the surviving knights wielded swords and halberds with deadly precision. Every arrow, every thrown stone, and every sword swing was a plea for survival. Yet outside, the Allied forces pressed relentlessly. By midday, small breaches had been made. Ladders were thrown against walls. Gates were battered with siege engines. The first defenders fell to the ground, others retreated to inner courtyards. The fighting became chaotic and brutal. Grappling hooks, swords, and axes in close quarters, soldiers struggling for every inch of stone. Smoke and dust thickened the air, mingling with the cries of men, the braying of horses, and the groans of the wounded. Despite the chaos, the Allied commanders maintained control. King the Ladislaw moved among his troops, inspiring men with words of encouragement, while Vytautas directed reinforcements to weak points. Slowly but surely, the fortress began to yield. Sections of the wall were taken, gates forced open, and the once imposing bastion trembled under the combined weight of Polish, Lithuanian, and Allied forces. By evening, the battle within Marienburg reached its climax. The surviving Teutonic Knights either surrendered, were slain, or fled into the inner citadel. Fires burned in parts of the fortress, and the Allied army took control of key positions. Though victory had been achieved, it was won at tremendous cost. Countless men wounded, many dead, and the echo of struggle lingering like a dark shadow across the stone. Grunwald had been the field where the Teutons were broken, but Marienburg was the heart of their power, now in the hands of the victors. The fall of the fortress marked the beginning of a new order in the region, though the scars of battle would remain long in memory. The days following the fall of Marienburg were somber, for the victory at Grunwald and the conquest of the fortress had been won at terrible cost. The fields around the city were still strewn with the remnants of battle, broken weapons, shattered armor, and the bodies of men who had given their lives for crown and country. Horses wandered among the dead, some limping, some collapsed, their eyes wide in silent suffering. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas moved through their camps with heavy hearts. They offered what aid they could to the wounded, directing priests and surgeons to care for those who could be saved. Yet even as bodies were tended, the magnitude of loss became apparent. Thousands of soldiers, both noble and common, had fallen. Some villages that had sent men to fight would find only silence upon their return, a homecoming marked by grief rather than celebration. The Allied commanders held councils to distribute the spoils of victory, ransom captured knights, and tend to the spoils of war. Yet even in these pragmatic tasks, the human toll weighed heavily. Families mourned, comrades grieved, and soldiers struggled with the memory of friends cut down beside them. Stories of heroism and sacrifice circulated, honoring the dead, yet no words could fully heal the wounds inflicted by such violence. Despite the sorrow, the victory reshaped the balance of power in the region. The Teutonic Order had been humbled, its ranks shattered, its leaders dead or captured, and its territory vulnerable. Poland and Lithuania, united in triumph, held the moral and military high ground. Neighboring states watched with awe, fear, or envy, understanding that the shadow of Grunwald and Marienburg would define politics and alliances for years to come. The men of the Allied army, though victorious, carried scars both visible and unseen. Eyes haunted by the battlefield, hands calloused and bloodied, hearts heavy with the memory of fallen comrades. The songs and prayers of thanksgiving were tinged with sorrow, for the cost of triumph had been undeniable. Victory, though glorious, was not without its bitter price. Yet even amidst grief, a sense of enduring hope lingered. The kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania had proven their strength and resolve. The legend of the Battle of Grunwald would be remembered not only for the heroism displayed but also for the terrible price that human lives paid upon the altar of war. In the years that followed the Great Battle of Grunwald, the memory of that day became legend, passed from lips to lips, from chronicler to bard, and from father to son. The names of heroes, knights, peasants, and horsemen alike, were etched into the consciousness of nations, a testament to courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Villages rebuilt their homes and fields, yet the scars of war remained. Graves were dug in countless fields, often hurriedly, marked by simple stones or crosses, for the dead numbered far too many for individual monuments. In towns and cities, churches rang bells in solemn remembrance, masses were held, and prayers offered for the souls of those who had perished. Each year, on the anniversary of the battle, the faithful would gather to honor the fallen, recounting the bravery and tragedies of that fateful day. Poland and Lithuania emerged stronger, their alliance fortified by shared blood and struggle. The Teutonic Order, though wounded, endured in spirit, rebuilding its ranks slowly and nursing the memory of defeat with bitter determination. Yet Grunwald had altered the balance of power in the region irrevocably. The shadow of that victory loomed over the order, a warning to all who sought to challenge the unity and might of the Allied kingdoms. Stories of individual heroism became the subject of song and chronicle. Peasants who had stood against armored knights, archers whose arrows struck with uncanny precision, and commanders whose strategic wisdom had turned the tide were celebrated. The battle became more than a clash of armies. It was a symbol of resistance, courage, and the resilience of ordinary men when faced with the extraordinary. King the Ladislaw and Grand Duke Vytautas were remembered not only as leaders but as men who bore the terrible weight of command with wisdom and humanity. Their decisions had shaped the course of history, balancing strategy, diplomacy, and compassion amidst the chaos of war. In years to come, chroniclers would write of their foresight, their prudence, and their unshakable resolve. The land itself carried the memory. Fields once soaked in blood returned to green, forests regrew along the edges of battle, yet the whispers of the past seemed ever present. Travelers spoke of the echoes of steel upon steel, the ghostly cries of the fallen, and the banners that once swept across the horizon. Grunwald, though centuries passed, remained alive in memory, a testament to the human spirit, the costs of ambition, and the enduring power of courage. Thus ended the tale of the Great Battle of Grunwald and the fall of Marienburg. Its legacy endured, not merely in the victories won or the lives lost, but in the stories told, the hearts inspired, and the lessons etched into the annals of history. In the chronicles of time, it remained a day when kingdoms clashed, men became legends, and the course of nations was forever altered.